We're pleased to welcome you to ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, a webinar on the topic of inciting and enabling the mob, social media's role in attacks on minorities and the Middle East. Please be aware that this call is being recorded. After we hear from our speakers, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question at any time during the call, simply open the chat box on the bottom of the Zoom program and type in your question. I'd like to, at this time, welcome ADL CEO Jonathan Greenblatt to offer some welcoming remarks. Jonathan?
Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for this timely webinar on a subject that is of vital importance to ADL. As I think everyone knows, the issue of combating online hate, specifically on social media platforms, is a top priority for this organization. We know that the extremism and bigotry expressed on social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter doesn't just live online, but jumps offline with real-world consequences. We see the impact of online hate in real-world violent attacks against Jews here in the US and around the world, against the Asian community, against Muslim minorities, such as the Rohingya in Myanmar, as we will hear today, against other religious and sexual and ethnic communities across the Middle East. Often, online hate is promoted by governments who use it as a tactic to target, marginalize, and repress particular communities, such is the case with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The regime uses social media while limiting the access of their citizens as a means to oppress their own people, regardless of where it comes from in society, and to amplify the voices of religious extremists who distort religions and do so, to demonize marginalized groups. Few individuals are more aware of this phenomenon than Dr. Ahmed Shaheed, who has spent years advocating on behalf of persecuted minority groups across the globe. Likewise, the member of ADL's task force, who you'll hear from today, all have experienced firsthand themselves how governments and societies across the Middle East use social media to target minority groups, often resulting in violent assaults against those communities. As an organization that for more than 100 years has been committed to stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment to all, I am proud of the advocacy and educational work our task force has done since it was launched in 2018 on behalf of persecuted minorities across the Middle East. I want to use this opportunity today on this platform to personally thank Dr. Sharon Nazarian, Senior Vice President of International Affairs for ADL, for her leadership, and all the members of the ADL Task Force on Middle East Minorities for their fearlessness, for their steadfastness, and for all that they have done, facing some degree of persecution and threat themselves, to speak up for the rights of others. And we are so proud, so honored at ADL to be working in collaboration with them and to helping elevate their perspectives. And again, I want to thank Dr. Shaheed for his courageous and tireless advocacy on behalf of vulnerable communities around the world. Sharon, back to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ahmed Shaheed and just a little bit of background for his opening remarks. His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Shaheed is the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. He is also serving as Deputy Director of the Essex Human Rights Center and previously served as the first UN Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. As a career diplomat, he has also twice held the office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Maldives. After Dr. Shaheed's opening remarks, we'll then continue our program with our 4 expert panelists. I'll just give a very quick background to each of them. Farnaz Isfahani is a former Pakistani lawmaker, steering committee member of the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, and ADL Task Force on Middle East Minorities co-chair. Aykan Erdemir is Senior Director of Turkey at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, also a former Turkish lawmaker and IPP4 Steering Committee member. Marjan Kapur Greenblatt, Founder and Director of Alliance for Rights of All Minorities, as well as obviously a member of our ADL task force. And last but not least, Ali Raza Nader is a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Iran program. And again, we're lucky enough to have him on our task force. So with that, Dr. Shaheed, the floor is yours. We welcome your opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Nazarian. Thank you so much for inviting me to this important webinar. And thank you and Dr. Greenblatt for the very kind words expressed about my work. It's a real pleasure to join the fellow panelists here, extremely expert in their work on this important subject. Today we talk about the role of social media and attacks on minorities, especially in the Middle East. The use of social media to incite and enable mob violence is a global problem, as Jonathan intimated in his opening comments, but it becomes even more dangerous in situations where there is widespread discrimination, glaring deficits in the rule of law, and where the state is complicit in the efforts of non-state actors to incite mob violence. Certain legal frameworks like blasphemy laws, for example, are ready-made to incite, to facilitate violence by mobs against people in vulnerable situations. The challenges such violence poses to minorities, not just minorities, including the fear of such violence, are a matter of serious concern to the UN mandate that I hold, as I've outlined in several of my reports to the UN. And where religious minorities are compelled to live in a climate of well-grounded fear, the impacts are not just limited to attacks that they may face, but have a deep-seated and an all-round chilling effect on the exercise and enjoyment of all their human rights. I have sought to engage with this subject in my work for the UN over the past 5 years of my current mandate, including specifically on the role of social media in enabling hostilities through mobs, as well as, of course, the role social media platforms can play in countering such incitement to violence. As many of you know, I am tasked by the UN Human Rights Council to examine trends globally that affect the enjoyment by all on equal footing of the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief, to identify emerging and existing obstacles to the enjoyment of these rights, to document incidents of violation of these rights by non-state actors, and to monitor governmental actions that are inconsistent with their obligation to ensure that all can enjoy their human rights, including elimination of all forms of intolerance, of discrimination based on religion or belief. In this context, intolerance includes any distinction, preference, or exclusion that is based on one's religious or belief identity, and that has the intention or the effect of nullifying or impairing the enjoyment of any human right, be it economic, social, cultural, civil, or political. Thus, intolerance based on religion can impact on the full range of human rights a person is entitled to exercise. My thematic reports have covered issues such as globally surging anti-Semitism, rampant Islamophobia, and intensifying attacks on Christian minorities and other religious groups such as the Baha'i, Ahmadis, Shia, Sikhs, and Hindus, to name a few. I have specifically highlighted the role played by online incitement and appeal to states and tech companies to respond to this situation with sufficient and appropriate means. One lesson that I have drawn, and this is probably valid for all social phenomena, is the impossibility of compartmentalizing the online world from the offline world. In several contexts, separating what is institutional from what is private and what is systemic from what is episodic. Of course, such differentiation makes sense analytically and in shaping policies, and to ensure that our responses are targeted, effective, and comprehensive, and can take a whole of society approach. Our responses must recognize that while the internet today is the premier global public forum, the offline and the online world are interconnected, and all too often, non-state actor incitement and official government practices are connected, especially in the Middle East, as in other contexts of poor governmental accountability. In addition to my thematic reports, I have also worked with other UN special rapporteurs and other UN bodies and actors to encourage all duty bearers and stakeholders to play crucial roles in responding to such incitement in ways that respect the human rights framework. I have called on social media companies to more vigorously enforce their community terms of service, increase investment in content moderation, including training of such moderators in human rights standards, as well as in their awareness of local contexts, to increase transparency on how these standards are actually implemented by the companies, and to build capacity for civil society actors to monitor trends and to hold such companies accountable. Other urgent and vital offline measures include solidarity enhancing initiatives and investments in education and in peer-to-peer learning as long-term investments as antidotes to the potency of prejudice and bigotry, as well as increase accountability for state failure to respond to incitement and or to strengthen the civic space for all. I've specifically highlighted certain legal frameworks that must change to make sure that incitement to violence doesn't occur because of gaps in the legal framework. In some areas, of course, our situation is improving with increased voices calling for more stringent measures by social media companies to curtail the use of their platforms to advocate for violence, as well as steps by several companies themselves to counter such uses. The development of tech tools, including algorithms capable of increasing capacity for content moderation and countermeasures. And there are also a growing number of initiatives to educate the public of the dangers of incitement, from the ADL's very helpful Pyramid of Hate to the OHCHR's Rabat Plan of Action, to the UN's Global Strategy Against Hate. And as you will see and hear later today from the panelists speaking today, the need for these measures is particularly strong in the Middle East, a region that is the cradle of so many great civilizations, but is today home for so many despots, dictators, and their foot soldiers of hate. Tech companies cannot pretend to be merely neutral platforms. Neutrality assumes there's a moral equivalence between the options available. This is not the case between protecting communities and becoming force multipliers for evil. They must recognize that with the great power they have as platforms, they have to live up to the great responsibility that comes with it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Shaheed, thank you so much for those very important comments. And obviously, we at ADL not only completely concur and agree with you, but hope to be part of the education and the documenting of all the patterns that you've laid out. And thank you for staying on, by the way, so our audience can also come back to you at the Q&A and ask questions if they have it. With that, I'm going to now turn to our esteemed panel of activists, scholars, and advocates that I've already introduced. So welcome. And maybe just taking what Dr. Shaheed has so clearly laid out in terms of the role of social media platforms and others. Icon, perhaps I'll start with you, because obviously something that's very clear to us at ADL is that what happens online doesn't stay online. And Icon, you in your Washington Post op-ed on anti-Semitism on Turkey's public broadcaster very clearly made that point. You mentioned how anti-Semitic content on TV had spilled over to social media and then actually triggered incitement against Jews in Turkey. What role, Icon, do social media platforms play in disseminating and escalating hate produced in mainstream media outlets today, in your view? Icon, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Dr. Shaheed. To be frank, social media works in multiple ways, and I'll give you a couple of examples. To go back to the case you presented, back in 2007, when Turkey's public broadcaster, TRT, screened a blatantly anti-Semitic historical drama, namely The Last Emperor, it provoked widespread incitement on social media, especially Twitter. For example, after the broadcast of one particularly anti-Semitic episode, demonizing Jews, one Twitter user vowed to turn the Jewish homeland into a quote-unquote Jewish graveyard. Another one declared, again on Twitter, quote, "The more I watch The Last Emperor, the more my enmity to Jews increases. You infidels, you filthy creatures," end quote. Now, this is what I call the media to social media continuum. That is, hate produced on mainstream media outlets, on state-funded media outlets, then gets disseminated to the wider public through social media platforms. In fact, after such incitement, we witnessed a spike in hate crimes targeting Turkey's Jewish community, including physical attacks at synagogues in Istanbul. Now, a second type of hate dissemination is when social media itself becomes the origin of hate content, which then finds space in mainstream media outlets. For example, last year in Turkey, we had an ultra-nationalist Turkish politician who filmed his interactions with a Syrian Turkish shopkeeper and then shared it on social media. Although this encounter was very cordial and undermined almost all of the anti-Syrian stereotypes, by providing an example of successful social and economic integration, the ultra-nationalist politician in question shared the video on social media, on Twitter, alongside his xenophobic comments. This hate message then got picked up by mainstream media outlets and reached a wider audience beyond social media. Now, the end result proved that such incitement could be lethal, because as recently as last week, we have seen not only looting of Syrian businesses in various cities around Turkey, but we have seen lynchings of Syrian asylum seekers. And in all of these attacks, we have seen that they were motivated by tropes repeated on media and social media, such as Syrian asylum seekers are free riders who steal scarce resources away from Turkish citizens in need. Let me end with a third case where I would like to discuss how hate content spills over within social media, that is, from state-run troll farms into other social media accounts, and then triggers not only state persecution of minorities, but also mob violence targeting minorities. The Turkish government over the years has systematically criminalized Turkey's pro-Kurdish politicians as terrorists, and Turkey's state-funded troll farms on social media have pushed this message repeatedly. Then we have seen this spill over to, individual social media accounts and the demonization of not only Kurds, but also pro-Kurdish politicians who might not be Kurdish as terrorists. And as recently as last year, we have seen repeated attacks targeting pro-Kurdish politicians, as well as Kurdish individuals, many of which ended in killings or severe physical injuries. So I think these three cases show us that social media can work in different ways, both with mainstream media outlets, as well as basically with the word of mouth mob mentality on the streets to result in really lethal results for Turkey's and thus the Middle East vulnerable minorities.
Icon, thank you. Those are very important examples and really speaks to the issue at hand in terms of what are the dangers out there. Turning from Turkey to Iran, Ali, maybe I'll turn to you next. As an expert on Iran, tell us a little bit about how the Islamic Republic of Iran uses social media for its authoritarian purposes. I mean, can you please just elaborate a little bit on the increased repression against religious minorities in Iran, especially during periods of instability like today with the economic pressures and so on? Tell us a little bit about how the state itself directs such attacks.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you everybody at ADL, Jonathan, and everybody in the panel. It's a real pleasure to be with such an august group of people. Increasingly, social media is very crucial to the survival of the Islamic Republic in Iran. We've seen the regime in Iran experience several major popular uprisings in the last 4 years, starting with the December uprisings, December 2017 uprisings. And every day we see minor and major protests in Iran. And for the Islamic Republic, social media serves several purposes to ensuring its stability and serving its interests. First of all, the regime wants to make sure the world doesn't see what's happening in Iran. So for example, during the Aban or November 2019 uprising, the regime shut down the internet and massacred, according to Reuters, at least 1,500 Iranian protesters. There's evidence to suggest the number is much higher than that, actually. But the regime's attempts to hide the truth really have prevented the international community from knowing the full extent of the massacre in 2019. There's several reasons as to why we don't get information from Iran. One is the regime's control of the internet and social media, or attempts to control the internet and social media. And we're not getting a lot of information from mainstream media. There are not a lot of Western reporters based in Iran. And unfortunately, a lot of news concerning Iran has been politicized in the West, mainly because of the nuclear issue and the nuclear agreement, JCPOA. So the information we really get from Iran is really through social media. And some of the major news broadcasters that broadcast news from Iran in Persian especially really rely on firsthand testimony from everyday Iranians who are cataloging this extent of human rights abuses happening in Iran. And I think as the nuclear issue in Iran becomes more of a concern to the international community, and really the nuclear issue has always dominated and monopolized the issue of Iran to the detriment of human rights. And I think that trend is going to continue and even increase because the world is rightly afraid of an Iranian nuclear weapon, especially with nuclear negotiations currently deadlocked. But unfortunately, the world has also decided that the people of Iran really don't matter as much when it comes to the nuclear issue. So I think it's very important for civil rights and human rights organizations to make sure that the rest of the world does see what's happening in Iran, that the nuclear issue is not the dominant issue in the discourse about Iran, and that human rights for all Iranians, but especially ethnic and religious minorities, really gets exposure. Looking forward, I really do believe Iran is going to experience increasing and massive unrest, especially as we come out of the COVID pandemic. Of course, COVID has had a devastating impact in Iran for the population, but you can make the argument it has dampened protests as well. I believe that will change. And regardless what kind of nuclear deal the Western world and its partners reach with Iran, I do not believe that the Islamic Republic is really capable of governance in Iran. And we're witnessing its, whatever you want to call it, decline, collapse in slow motion. And so we will see a lot more protests, a lot more human rights violations. And I really worried that religious minorities, like the Baha'is in Iran, Jewish Iranians, will become even bigger targets for the Islamic Republic. Recently, we witnessed a major anti-Baha'i campaign launched by the Islamic Republic and its agents and loyalists on social media. And not all the anti-Baha'i and anti-Semitic content comes out of Iran. There are people everywhere that promote the regime's brand of hatred. And Marjan will go into greater specifics regarding the focus on religious minorities. But I believe that as the regime becomes more unstable and cracks down more on the population. It will use Baha'is and Jews in Iran as an excuse to really even expand the authoritarian police state that exists in Iran right now. Once again, thank you for allowing me to talk, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ali, very much. And yes, staying in Iran, Marjan, I'm going to turn to you, and let's kind of go a little bit deeper in terms of how the way the regime propagates its propaganda machine, specifically targeting minority communities. You spend a lot of time monitoring ethnic, religious, sexual minorities in Iran. Talk to us a little bit about how does this impact the lives of those minority groups in Iran, Marjan?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. It's also really a pleasure to share the panel with Dr. Shaheed. And I want to thank you, Dr. Shaheed, for the work that you have done that has enabled the work of many of us working on Iran and human rights causes in general. Sharon, to address your question about the way that anti-religious minorities campaigns on social media actually affect life, real life for religious minorities, we have to pull the lens back and look at how the regime in general operates and how, what are the tactics and strategies that the Iranian regime applies towards its citizens. And the most simplified way of explaining the regime's strategies is that they use religion as a weapon and as a justification for repression, for creating divisions, and for oppressing the citizens of Iran. Religion is used, or their brand of Islam, or Shia Islam, is used to justify apartheid laws that are applied to religious minorities. They're applied to silence dissidents. Those are also applied to create repressive and discriminatory and hate speech that is applied against minorities and anyone who actually has something negative to say about the regime. But focusing just on the minorities, and again, many of these strategies and these intents can be applied to the dissidents in general. Social media and state-sanctioned media are very harmonized and very synchronized in many ways. And what is used on the monopolized monopolized state-sanctioned media is echoed and reflected in different ways through their social media outlets. And you can name all of the social media outlets across the board, from Telegram, Instagram, Twitters, and now these days even Clubhouse. And then they have real life implications in the lives of Iran's religious minorities. They demonize and dehumanize the minorities through their portrayals of Iran's minorities as bloodthirsty demons, as impure entities. Particularly when it comes to Baha'is and Jews, there is a lot of conversation about these groups being villains and against and unpatriotic, often referred to as infidels. You can extrapolate the term and its implications about infidels being disloyal and being unpatriotic and more loyal to outside entities than inside Iranian entities. And the irony of it all is that Baha'is the Baha'i faith is indigenous to the country of Iran, and no one is more patriotic than the Baha'is, whose religion has been born in Iran. Similarly, Jews, Christians, the Gonabadi dervishes, Sunnis, they have many years of presence and history in Iran. Nonetheless, on social media and on the state-sanctioned media, these groups are represented as threats to national security, as affiliates with terrorists, as affiliates with Zionists, and entities that are more loyal to the West and to terrorist ideations than preserving the Iranian values. Similarly, they create justifications for repressive measures and laws that are promoting division, apartheid, discrimination, such as fatwas against Baha'i businesses, that those businesses should not be frequented because of a whole host of prejudicial and disgusting perceptions regarding the Baha'i faith, including impurity or najasat, which is explained in great detail about other religious groups, including Jews and Christians, and the different levels of impurity that these religious groups represent in their practices and in their beliefs. So, and then finally, they use social media to discredit advocacy groups and advocates outside of Iran who try to shed light on these violations and on these atrocities that the Iranian minorities are experiencing. And they organize also very coordinated attacks against such activists and such entities, both inside the country and abroad, including hacking of websites, hacking of email accounts. I'm sure many of us have experienced this and, serving on this panel. But also they utilize the codes of conduct and the guidances of these platforms against against the users who are actually trying to shed light on the realities. So they are deplatforming individuals who are actually reporting these violations, but they're reporting their actions as inciting violence, whereas they're only reporting on the incitement of violence that has already happened by the Iranian regime. And this way they are controlling the level and the quality of speech that comes out on behalf of the activists and advocates. So many of the Iranian activists have been deplatformed from Instagram. They have been restricted on Twitter, from Facebook and so forth. I have to tell you that as an activist myself, I have been trying to promote just reporting mechanisms on Facebook, and I am often banned or not permitted to do that because when I'm reporting on violence, I am reported as one who is promoting violence myself, and I'm not able to shed light on some of the realities that are happening. And meanwhile, people who are spreading hate speech and division among the activists are alive and well. And the sad part is that the social media groups do not have the proper mechanisms. They don't have human algorithms. They just are relying on their own algorithms mechanically, and to figure out and make these distinguishments. Whereas what they really need are sophisticated, culturally and linguistically facile individuals who can distinguish the nuances that we are facing on social media. I can pause here and address some more later.
Thank you. No, that was a very wonderful and important deep dive into kind of the mechanisms of how regimes like Iran not only block any criticism, but also ferment hate online. Farnaz, maybe I'll turn to you because other than Iran, Pakistan has had the harshest blasphemy laws in the world, and that's a very effective tool, unfortunately, also in repressing speech and also targeting minority groups. You've written extensively about how even allegations of blasphemy in some countries can become a death sentence. I know there was a brutal incident recently in Pakistan, for example, in which a Sri Lankan factory manager was burnt alive after being accused of blasphemy. So tell us a little bit about how does social media fuel hatred against minorities when there are such blasphemy charges? And how does the social media kind of play a role into creating these mob frenzies? We've witnessed it, we've seen it, and you've very courageously reported on it. But tell us a little bit more about that, please, Farnaz.
Thank you, Sharon. Pakistan's blasphemy laws state that blaspheming against the Prophet Muhammad is punishable with death and imprisonment for life, while disrespecting the Quran is punishable by life imprisonment. This law has become so deep-rooted in Pakistan society that even the mere allegations of blasphemy can cause mobs to riot. Any attempt to bring changes has brought mobs out of this in the street. To put the social media aspect, which is what we are talking about today, in context, I'm going to drill down a little bit, but I just want to refer to Dr. Shaheed's opening remarks, where he talks about how government and society can become interrelated in the persecution of minorities through social media. So having talked about the blasphemy law and how, any attempt to change them could bring mobs into the street, etc. Now we'll turn to the social media. So basically, as we know, Pakistan's a majoritarian country, and out of Pakistan's overall population of approximately 200 million, 170 million are Sunni Muslims, which include the Deobandi, of which we know the Taliban Pakistan as being the leading extremist group. And Taliban Pakistan, as we know, uses direct violence in the form of bomb attacks, etc. The other is what used to be referred to as the soft Sunni or the Barelvi subsect, who now have an extreme wing represented by the TLP, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which mobilizes support on the basis of defending the Prophet Muhammad's honor. They're the so-called anti-blasphemy brigade, who incite and use mob violence. So how have these groups come into social media? Both the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and the TLP, Tehreek-e-Labbaik, have very active and effective social outreach, which they use to spread propaganda and orchestrate violence. And basically, in the old days, violence was more or less restricted to the supporters of these extremist groups. But today, young people, people who were conservative but not violent, have started using their voices on social media, which has led to violence on the ground. So that is where these two areas have come together in a very dangerous manner. In 2011, my former colleague and friend, the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, was killed by his own bodyguard, who was instigated to do so by the online speeches of radical cleric Khadim Hussain Rizvi. Rizvi, who was the founder of the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, claimed that anyone trying to amend the blasphemy laws was a blasphemer himself. His YouTube videos were seen by millions of Pakistanis, including Taseer's killer. Later, the killer was made into a hero and saint, and to this day, people go to his shrine and put flowers and pray to the person who assassinated Governor Taseer. So as one of the very, I think, leading experts, the UN Special Rapporteur, Fernand de Verre, has said on minority issues, he said the Holocaust did not start with the gas chambers. It started with hate speech against a minority. And we see today that social media has become a platform for the spread of hate, prejudice, and incitement to violence and atrocities against minorities. And that's what we see in Pakistan today. An example I'm going to give you is in July of 2014, an 18-year-old Ahmadi in Gujranwala in the Punjab province logged onto Facebook to announce that his team had won an inter-school cricket match. The rival captain, a non-Ahmadi, also logged on to vociferously dispute the result. Now, normally this would be just kids arguing about sports. But as the rival captain scrolled down the Ahmadi boy's Facebook page, he noticed an older comment under adopted and offensive image of the Holy Kaaba. Although the Ahmadi team was condemning the image on his Facebook page, it was still perceived as further circulating blasphemy. And when the boy showed the picture to his father, local cleric, he promptly issued a fatwa against the Ahmadi boy. The controversy percolated online and offline, ending in a rampage against local Ahmadi families. Some 8 Ahmadi houses were set ablaze. By the time the fires abated, at least 3 people were dead, an elderly woman, a 7-year-old girl, and an infant. In 2020, there was a rise in online sectarian attacks, hate speech, and cries of blasphemy. Toxic trending on Twitter blamed the ethnic Hazara community for allegedly bringing the coronavirus to Pakistan from neighboring Iran. Like most Iranians, Hazaras are Shiites and traditionally make pilgrimages to holy shrines in Iran, which had at that time the deadliest virus outbreak in the region. Some Pakistani pilgrims returned home and were among the first reported cases of COVID. After the hashtag Shia virus began trending on Twitter in April of that year, Hazaras were denied jobs, service at stores, even treatment in medical facilities. And this negative trend has only escalated in the years after. A small final example I will give you is how a Pakistani American was lured back to Pakistan by someone in his home province, entrapping him and enticing him to go back. And he went back and he was basically arrested for blasphemy. And at that time, when he appeared in a courtroom, he was shot dead and killed. So basically, they have, whether it's the hashtag campaigns, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, whether it's YouTube or any other kind, whether it's Ahmadis or Shias or Christians or Hindus or any other religious minority in Pakistan, very often online, these communities are described as worthy of death or non-Muslims or traitors in Pakistan, particularly if there's a way to link them to blasphemy. Thank you, Sharon.
Farnaz, thank you so much for those very concrete examples. And I think each of you have really laid out for us clearly how what happens on social media directly impacts violence, targeting, discrimination, abuse against many minority communities. Maybe I'll end our panel questions by turning back to Icon, because social media platforms can also be used for rights advocates. Many of us use social media to educate and to push back against hate and prejudice. So maybe to end on a positive note, Icon, maybe you can give us some examples, some positive examples of the ways in which visionary public figures, Dr. Shaheed himself right here with us, do use social media to escalate crises, to promote pluralist, inclusive values. Talk to us a little bit about maybe in Turkey or generally speaking, Icon, if you could give us some examples, please.
Sure, Sharon. On social media, kindness, just as hate, could be contagious. And in fact, that's what the ADL Task Force on Middle East Minorities has been trying to do. In Turkey, for example, one public figure that uses social media to promote pluralism, social inclusion, and acceptance is the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu. Now, in 2019, shortly after his election, he took to the social media to celebrate Passover in a country where the Twitter space is extremely anti-Semitic. And to everyone's delight, to my delight as well, he received over 100,000 likes. And one of the best responses he received was by a young Turkish Jew who said, "What surprised me, sir," he said, "is not your kind message, but what surprised me was not seeing a single anti-Semitic message below your tweet." He said, "This is your success." So yes, kindness can be contagious. And also such positive messaging could also be bottom up. You don't need to be, the mayor of Istanbul to make an impact. For example, in Turkey, many of the refugee advocates have taken to social media to present positive stories about Syrian asylum seekers, stories that cannot find place in mainstream media outlets. So such social media content provides examples of humanizing examples of Syrian refugee success stories, such as a Syrian student's outstanding success in Turkey's centralized exams, Syrian businesses' success in creating employment, and Syrian success in providing much needed labor in sectors that suffer from labor shortages. And finally, let me end with how social media itself was of great help to us Turkish lawmakers while we were trying to pass a hate crimes bill. Now, while we were discussing this bill in Parliament, which got some media coverage, we have seen enormous help by Turkey's LGBTQ individuals, their families and allies who took to social media to promote pluralist, inclusive, accepting messages, as well as raise awareness about the need for a hate crimes bill. And thanks to their efforts, a lot of our debates at Parliament reached a much broader public. And this, I think, is yet another reminder that even when social media companies fail in pushing hate and incitement from their platforms, individuals, all the way from the bottom to the very top, can use those very same platforms to promote pluralism, social inclusion, and embrace of diversity.
Those are really great examples. Marjan, maybe I'll give you the last word and talking a little bit more about positive examples. Obviously, building solidarity, helping diaspora communities have a bigger voice. Talk to us a little bit about positive examples you've seen in your work, and then from there we'll go on to take a couple of questions from our audience. Marjan, go ahead, please.
Sure. Just a couple of examples came to my mind as Icon was talking about kindness being contagious on social media. And I was reminded of solidarity campaigns with the Baha'i community and how nice it is when users of social media on an international scale they use the hashtag Baha'i is not a crime and stood in solidarity with the Baha'i community against so many atrocities and negative hate messages that were being spread about them on social media. Similarly, several years ago, a group of Iranian-based activists organized a hashtag that would be released on Iran's Quds Day, which is a day when officially the Iranian regime condemns the establishment of the State of Israel. And they created a campaign calling it the No Hate Day. And a lot of these users came out with Iranian and Israeli flags conjoined together in some beautiful, amazing graphics. And it was all done with folks inside the country. And they came to spread a message of friendship and positivity and peace between the Iranian people and the people of Israel. And I hope to see more efforts like this, and more, less division, less suspicion, and more unity and more collaboration between all of the users on social media. I think one of us can model what it is like to use the social media in a positive, in a peaceful way, to collaborate and to join in something positive rather than spreading negativity and negative comments and hate. We can model this among ourselves. And again, as Icon said, the task force is a great place and a great example for this. So feel free to communicate with us on social media.
Sharon, could I just jump in for 30 seconds on this theme, which I think is fantastic? Two ways I would say that in Pakistan, we see a positive, but it's growing aspect of social media is, number one, a lot of issues like forced conversion of young underage Christian and Hindu girls, which were never really talked about, has been brought into the conversation and become global through the work of human rights activists and minority activists and people from the communities. And so there's a lot more knowledge and a lot more awareness. And the other thing is we actually have seen cases where there's been justice because there's been such rage. Mm-hmm. A Sri Lankan Christian was a manager of a factory, was literally burned to death by a crowd. And that video went viral. But on social media, the reaction was so angry against the TLP, the perpetrators, and demanding justice that there was an outpouring of support for the late gentleman and his family. And so we are seeing a strength developing and actual results on the ground, which is something very new.
That's fantastic, Farnaz and Marjan. Thank you for your really wonderful words at the end of saying we can be a force for good using those same platforms that unfortunately are too often utilized for hate. I do want to take some questions from the audience that have been coming in. And Dr. Shaheed, maybe I'll take the first one directed to you because it is a UN related question from one of our viewers. The viewer writes, a few years ago, the UNDPPA was experimenting with tools to measure sentiment analysis on social media. They were analyzing Yemeni Arabic to identify early warnings of potential conflict. How have efforts to monitor social media progressed, including AI technology? If you know anything about it, I'm not sure if you've really delved into that. And the viewer thanks the panel for a wonderful discussion. Do you have any information on that? How has technology such as AI been used?
Yes, indeed. Very good question. On the specific element, I don't have information on. But at the present time, both the work of the OSCHR, work of special rapporteurs and others, we use social media tools for monitoring, documentation, as well as early warning. One good example we can refer to is Amnesty International's Digital Verification Project, which has used social media postings, in this case, for recreating pictures for accountability. But UNHCR, for example, the refugees agency, they use big data. They use social media postings to identify, if you like, high risk areas. So social media is used by AI, by applying AI tools to identify trends and then to have responses, that can get to that. An example would be if someone monitors, for example, say, postings of sale of, say, cattle in a place, and then, I've seen examples where this has been then indicated to a possible, exodus of communities from one area. So there are ways people have read using different natural language processing tools and other things to really document and interpret postings on social media that then correlate using algorithmic data to identify possible risks and trend. So it is an area of usage, area of great use, an area in which special rapporteurs, OSCHR and other UN bodies are increasingly relying on for early response purposes, as well as accountability after the fact.
Thank you. That's really very interesting. I want to go to another question from another viewer, and maybe Ali, I'll turn this to you. This is something that we at ADL have focused a lot on. The question is, do panelists think mainstream social media companies have a different stance in their efforts or policies to combat online hate speech targeting minorities in languages other than English compared to social media company efforts in English? So you monitor social media in Farsi, in Persian, and in English, obviously. Do you see a difference?
That's a very good question, actually. I mean, in general, I think social media companies, the major tech companies, do a really poor job of restricting those who promote hate, like Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader or dictator of Iran. Twitter has not stopped Khamenei's account from broadcasting hate speech, including destruction of Israel, in English or in Persian. So I think in general, they do a really inadequate job of monitoring hate speech in both languages. But also I've noticed very disturbingly the major tech companies shutting down accounts of major dissidents. There's one account by the name of Ayatollah Tanasoli, which is we don't know who the person running it is, and that account was shut down, as were a number of other accounts on Twitter and Instagram criticizing the regime, not using violent language whatsoever, not, as I've seen, breaking the rules and standards. So I think social media companies need to do a much better job of really figuring out who these dissidents are, and preventing the regime from shutting down these accounts by doing whatever the Islamic Republic does. It has figured out how to really silence dissent on social media and intimidate dissidents as well.
Thank you. And maybe our last question, given that the annual International Holocaust Remembrance Day is just around the corner in a couple of weeks, this question maybe to Farnaz, or if Dr. Shaheed, you want to take it as well. ADL has done a lot of work on the universal lessons of the Holocaust, including the danger of dehumanizing messages, which we see a lot of on social media today. How do those sorts of lessons and histories pertain to public discourse and debates in the Middle East and in the plight of Middle East minorities in particular? Farnaz, if you want to take that, just a quick answer, and maybe Dr. Shaheed, you can also talk about the universal lessons learned from the Holocaust and how do we help fight online hate using those lessons?
Just very briefly, Sharon, I have often used this expression that for all of our modern conversations around hate, that the Holocaust and that entire experience was where so many people learned how to use hatred against the other. And what we also have to remember, the universal message of not forgetting and remembering the lessons of those who fought and those who survived to tell the story. So that is basically, I think, what I'd have to say, but Dr. Shaheed will obviously have something deeper.
Dr. Shaheed?
I agree with Farnaz. Obviously, yes, as I said, the Holocaust is a single, if you like, biggest demonstration of how the most graphic demonstration of what can go wrong if we let hate speech just go unchecked. But the lessons are abiding for every community, for everyone. And of course, there are communities even today which look at the Nazi propaganda machine as something to emulate, as a way that they can use hatred for their own, evil ends. And we've seen many communities, in the past 70 years, in many situations where there have been mass atrocities, there have been genocides, often that follow all sorts of hatred, whether it's the radio station or some other form of hatred. The spewing out hatred ultimately leads to mass atrocities. So I think the abiding lesson of the Holocaust is that this can happen to anyone, and all it takes is others to not care. And then the minute you let a monster loose, and others don't care to stop it, then anybody can become victim. And what I say is that, for example, anti-Semitism is one form of hatred, is one of the older forms of hatred, but people who promote anti-Semitic tropes can easily promote other forms of hatred, and one form can easily to another one. So it's all interrelated. That's why we should all work together and recognize that hate in any form is a threat to all of us at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheed. Thank you to all our panelists for this very informative webinar.